Let's start with an example which is known as the law of attraction. The law of attraction is based on an illusion. The illusion is that you can somehow create reality from thinking and imagination. So you imagine a future scenario or event in your mind through thought. You create the desire for the event to happen. Out of this, in the back of your mind you create a thought attachment to an expectation that whatever you imagined will become some manifestation of actual reality. So when in the event that reality unfolds in a way which kind of matches what you imagined it to be, you immediately fall into the assumption that you created the reality and you brought about the change. This is of course not true. But this also cuts both ways. If the imagined reality doesn't match up to the way it was imagined, you assume that you created something different. You assume that you attracted the bad karma, the bad luck, and that you were responsible for the unfolding reality. Then you buy into the whole personal responsibility illusion, start feeling guilty, maybe shame, and blaming yourself for something which had nothing to do with you to begin with. The law of attraction is not an actual law, even on the same level of natural law, but just a thought pattern, a belief, something which exists only in the imagination. You can reverse the thought process or pattern, or the belief pattern, and you end up with cause and effect. The only difference is that, instead of focusing on the future as you do with the law of attraction, you're focusing on the past. You're looking at an event or situation in isolation from its process and imagining a cause. The effect in your mind has a specific cause, and so mentally through thought you stitch together the cause and the effect. You're not understanding the process. You probably don't understand the relationship between the two things you picked up randomly. You just go right ahead and assume the cause and effect are directly relative to one another. When you start applying cause and effect to yourself and other people, you get caught up, via moral reasoning, in the psychological mind games of praise and blame, worthiness and lack of worthiness, merit and lack of, deserving and not deserving, and so on, and so forth. This leads to value judgments and the whole struggle for self-esteem and self-confidence. When you start mixing up different levels of reality, and not liking people for existential reasons, skin color, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, physical abilities, and so on, you get into the various issues with racism, sexism and bigotry. None of these things are really real, they're just psychological mind games. Just like cause and effect. Just like the law of attraction. Just like positive thinking and so many other cultural illusions. I often refer to one's internal architecture here. What I mean by internal architecture are the senses, the felt sense of immediate experience, memory, and the mind. These are all things which are part of the brain and sensory nervous system which you were born with and which are designed to work cohesively together. Within all this you have a focus of conscious attention which, through conscious awareness, you can focus in and out of things in your environment. This is everything you were born with. Now we are subjected from early childhood to a process of social and mental conditioning. The point of social conditioning is to create and maintain an ego, or a sense of identity so as to participate in society. The ego is a sense of self and identity usually associated with social roles and a set of beliefs which you are taught, conditioned to believe, and which you develop by yourself based on your direct experience of life. You develop all these things through thinking which you do constantly. The ego is based on your narrow focus of attention and as a result your internal architecture or mental faculties is reduced to memory and imagination together with the mind. Imagination is essentially the same as memory, but as thought is dependent on time, memory is what you use for the past, and imagination is what you use for the future. There's still connection to sense and sensitivity, but it's reduced due to the focus or heavy emphasis on the ego and thinking. As a result, your conscious perspective is reduced or limited simply because you're not using your whole internal architecture or mental faculties. The key issue with social conditioning is separateness, which manifests as separateness between self and environment and also between self and other. There's two different aspects to this. The first is that the many different levels of reality are lumped into just one level, or reality in general. There's an infinite number of levels of reality because we cannot directly perceive ultimate reality. Reality manifests relative to mind and perception, but it's important to remember that the reality you perceive is just another manifestation of reality relative to your level of conscious awareness. This is part of what is known as the mystical transaction, the relationship based on perception between your brain and your environment. The second aspect is the ego itself, which is the central character in someone's storyline, which is a story, a narrative, a belief system built up and associated with various roles. The ego is created and maintained through thought and belief. Thought is impermanent, because you get one thought after another. It's only the dependence on time that gives thought a sense of continuity and permanence. Through thought we measure time, and we measure time against our thoughts, interactions and actions. Some people measure time from mealtime to mealtime. Many people measure time from going to work to finishing work. When they finish work they think about when they have to go to work again. When they go to work they think about finishing work. Then we all measure time in a way from the phases of the moon and the earth orbiting the sun. We measure time from birthday to birthday. We are constantly measuring time in some way. So what you end up with is a distorted perspective working within a trifecta between memory, imagination and the mind, with the ego or self-centered me at the center. As a result, you put a psychological and emotional spin on everything, creating additional layers of reality on top of the existing manifestations of reality. It's important to understand that social conditioning doesn't just require you to develop an ego, or an identity based on your various social roles. It also works on your imagination by convincing you that you have some sort of future, so you subconsciously have not only an ego and sense of identity which arises out of memory. So you don't just have an ego, you also have a future version of your ego and self-centered me. So you're constantly thinking about what is going to happen to you. What is going to happen to me? You're constantly thinking about death, about growing old, about retirement, about what you're going to do after work, about what you're doing at the weekend. How will you be spending Christmas? Constant thoughts about the future. This has the effect of distorting your individual perspective on life even more. This is because thought requires a sense of permanence and continuity. And we think all the time. But thought is not just about time and measuring time. Thought is also dependent on energy, and we can label this energy either fear or desire. There's a basic polarity or duality about fear and desire, which is very much like the poles of a magnet. It's all about attraction and repulsion. Desire is attraction, and fear is repulsion. However, there's a major difference. With a magnet you get either attraction or repulsion as a solitary clear manifestation of energy. But with thought, desire and fear combine into the same thought. Anything you want or desire creates a fear of not getting it. Anything you fear creates a desire to avoid it. Fear and desire combine to provide the basis for what we call motivation. So what you end up with are two completely different processes going on in your life. You've got a social process going on, the one where the ego takes center stage. This is the process dominated by thinking and thoughts. The one which is centered around the self-centered me. You get up in the morning. You go to work. You work. You come home from work. You have your after-work activities. If you don't work, you have other things going on. You have your evening activities, entertainment, pleasure, hobbies, your social and personal relationships, taking care of your body and physical needs, and so on. This process is reinforced by thinking. Everything you experience or witness is recorded into memory through perception and sense, and through thought gives you knowledge. So the more you experience, the more things you witness, the more things get recorded into memory and the more knowledge you develop. This is why formal education, a major part of the social conditioning process, focuses on developing the memory. Everything you get taught at school, in university or college, gets recorded into memory, and becomes knowledge. You develop knowledge through thinking, and there's a certain path of learning through knowledge. Then you have a second process going on, a natural process which is far more existential and much more connected to your being, or ground of being. This second process is taking place on a different level of reality. This level of reality is that what is really real. On this level of reality you have your physical body or organism, your brain, your natural environment, this planet, and actual reality. Both these processes on different levels of reality are part of the same process, which can be described as a karmic process. I don't want to go too deeply into karma or the karmic process, partly because it's complicated, and partly because we're focusing on the imagination and how our imagination impedes or hinders our perception of reality. But karma arises out of trauma, which is force, or forced change, and karma, which is essentially memory and action or activity, unfolds out of past trauma as a process. We all have our own unfolding karmic process going on out of the different levels of reality and planes of consciousness. So what you end up with is life coming at you from all directions constantly, across different levels of reality and planes of consciousness. It's a never-ending stream of stuff you're more familiar with, stuff you're less familiar with, conflicts, puzzles, things that don't naturally or logically go together, and stuff you've got to think about to make things work. If your life is more routine, then most of your life will be humdrum and routine and familiar, but you'll still get unexpected twists and turns, and maybe every so often life will kind of fall apart just to keep you on your toes. So what do you have in response to all this? Well, you have imagery, imagination, language, and of course your focus of conscious attention. That's it. The focus of conscious attention is the important part here. You can focus in, which means less conscious awareness, but you align more with the physical. The thinking mind, the ego, the physical and material levels of reality. You can also focus out, and move towards sense, sensitivity, senses, and the various manifestations of consciousness. This is the only real choice, and therefore freedom you have, and that is where you center yourself in terms of your focus or lack of and your conscious awareness. Now the part where many people come unstuck when they seek enlightenment, a spiritual path, salvation, or whatever is that they fail to understand the nature of the process they are subject to on higher levels of reality. Life is far more mysterious than most of us are prepared to admit. This is down to the unfolding nature of reality, existence and being. It's all part of the process. The mystery comes down to the fact that on these higher levels of reality and planes of existence there is no such thing as future. There is only the unfolding nature of the relationship in the present moment. The future isn't determined and is only at best a probability. But to understand this probability you need mystical or metaphysical awareness. You need to be familiar with mystical principles and to have that existential awareness of the process. Otherwise you get caught up in your imagination. Your imagination is not perception of reality or perception of anything. It's conception. Big difference. Perception is what happens when attention is focused not on self or being. Conception is what creates thought through perception and insight. Conception which arises out of memory is just imagination and an illusion. If you think of yourself as a creator, or some divine entity as a creator, then you're missing the point. You're still starting from a concept and trying to interpret actual reality and actuality from a concept. You're still centered on your ego and caught up in the triangular relationship between memory, imagination and mind. Your brain is a receiver and processor, not a creator. Creativity starts from perceiving an actuality that you were not previously consciously aware of and transforming that into insight, awareness, and understanding. Just as there are different levels of reality, and different planes of consciousness, there are different levels of being. Just to keep this simple, let's say that there are 3 levels of being: the ego, being or core being, and spirit, or soul. You were born as being. Through social conditioning you became the ego, but spirit is what got you here into this life or incarnation. But see, you cannot be spirit because you're embodied and attached to a physical body. It can manifest through specific manifestations, but this is way beyond memory. You might manifest through a dream, but see, when you wake up in the morning and try and interpret the dream through ego, it won't make much sense. This is despite the fact that when you were asleep and dream, it kind of made sense. You're dealing with different levels of reality, and what makes sense on one level doesn't necessarily make sense on another level. I have done dream interpretations, and usually the meaning or significance of a dream defies the common logical understanding of ego or the conditioned mind. I try to avoid dream interpretations because imagination gets in the way. It's usually better to wait and see if something manifests on another level of reality, such as that in your everyday consciousness. So the objective is to find a way of getting back from your ego and conditioned mind back into sense, sensitivity and being. This is the center point between the physical and metaphysical. It's what I call a balanced perspective, where you can go into your ego and conditioned mind when it's necessary and focus back out of it when it isn't. The key is to do this without getting caught up in your imagination. You really do need sense, not imagination. You need clarity of mind and perception, and imagination destroys that clarity and clouds both mind and perception. Each and every time you get caught up in imagination and confusing conception with perception. There are various different methods which will take you back to mindfulness. You have Kultura, which I developed about 15 years ago, you have Buddhism, you have Taoism, you have meditation, you have yoga in its many different forms. But the method doesn't really matter that much because it's a method, and if you're open-minded enough, any method is good enough, even different methods is good enough, because all you're doing is developing knowledge, not consciousness. But the moment you start thinking of some spiritual path with some future objective, be it mindfulness, salvation, increased conscious awareness, or whatever, you're trapped by your imagination and centered right back on your ego. It would be wonderful if we could all imagine ourselves to more enlightened, but that's not the way this works. The clue is in the word, imagination. Imagination is all about creating mental images from memory and projecting them into the present or future, or past. We do this constantly. We create images of ourselves, of other people, of specific situations, of certain roles, of things we desire, of things we fear, of so many other things. It is through imagination that we believe the physical world to be really real, solid, and permanent, and therein lies the illusion. The difficult thing to accept or understand is that order comes out of relationship, not structure, and it is your relationship with your environment, your mind, your perception, that is creating the order in what you perceive in your environment and other people. It's your sensory input, through your senses and sensory perception, that is giving you the raw data or code to work with. But when you're perceiving and conceiving at the same time through imagination, you're distorting your perception and developing a distorted or even a false perception of what is. The other major issue you face when trying to liberate yourself from your past social conditioning, ego and all that jazz, is that you're usually seeking something from your environment that doesn't exist. Trying to seek or find enlightenment or mindfulness from somewhere other than deep within you is rather like trying to find your legs in the bathroom when you wake up in the morning. No matter how hard you try, you will never find your legs in the bathroom because they're already attached to your physical body and you use them to walk to the bathroom. It's the exact same situation with enlightenment and mindfulness. You only need to do two things in life. The first is to accept that you exist. The second is that you have to connect between you and your environment and also you and other as much as you can. That's all you need to do in order to be successful at life. Everything else is additional. The more reality you give your ego and identity, the more you get trapped in your separateness and the more your perspective gets distorted. The more you get trapped into your separateness, the more you're relying on your imagination, the more stress, the more anxiety, the more fear, and therefore the more desire you create through your thinking. As a result, the further away you get from being and liberation, and further away you get from those manifestations of consciousness, simply because you're not centered or rooted in your ground of being. Let's also not overlook the social issues connected with liberation from social conditioning and ego, because they exist as well. You might be seeking liberation, but you'll still be dealing with the reality that most other people you encounter probably won't be liberated and will be taking their ego seriously. If you do find a way to become liberated, nobody will care that much, or if at all. Oh, for sure you can go off grid and go off somewhere and live like a hermit, but chances are you will have to deal with a certain amount of alienation. Please understand that everything you're seeking lies within. You need to create the space within you to bring yourself back to center. Shut up. Pay attention. Spend time in silence. Take a step back and see the whole social game for what it is, a game, a role play. It's a puppet show, and in this puppet show you, me, and everyone else are the puppets. Many people are puppets, believing themselves to be the center of the universe with their inflated egos and sense of self-importance, but very much controlled by their environment and authority figures. You don't actually need any method or spiritual practice or meditation, or yoga. You just need to be open-minded, sensitive, and relatively unconscious. See, once you become centered in your senses and felt sense of immediate experience, simply because nature abhors a vacuum, conscious awareness comes to you, and every experience you go through, every relationship, it all gives you some sort of insight or awakening. But you really do need to be centered in your being and on your senses and sensitivity. See, if you pay attention to what's going on around you, and the way people are acting and interacting, you will notice a lack of sensitivity in the way most people behave. This is simply because people take their egos and social roles way too seriously. They believe what's coming out of their imagination far more easily than what comes through their perception. This is what makes some people dangerous or somewhat threatening. You can perceive the same reality as they are perceiving, but you have no way of knowing what's going through their imagination. It's like if you're wearing flamboyant clothing or have a flamboyant hairstyle. Most people will pay more attention to your clothes and your hairstyle than they will you, the human being behind both hairstyle and clothing. The ego always gravitates towards the superficial, the illusory, the physical appearance, the conceptual, missing out on the reality behind or deeper than this. It's all ooh looky shiny new object. The distractions. The attention grabs. It's all on the most superficial, shallow levels of reality. Therefore there's a kind of imperative, if you are serious about liberation from ego and social conditioning, to still play your ego and social roles, but do so lightly, with sensitivity, and not take everything far too seriously. You also need to find your people who can be just as sensitive and insightful as you are. People on your level. There's nothing worse than to be surrounded by people who either take the material too seriously, or they are so dry and spiritual that their heads are well and truly wedged up the backsides. What you need here is sensitivity, not imagination.